Joe Biden is going to be the 46th president of the United States. Cue the champagne corks popping at Democratic HQ and in the Biden basement in Delaware. But unlike here in Britain, where a new leader usually sweeps into power with control of Parliament,
Prime Minister!
American presidents aren't guaranteed to have the votes to actually pass any laws. How much a president can actually get done depends on whether the balance of Congress is in their favour. So as Joe Biden assembles his team for 4 years at the helm, let's take a look at how much power he can expect to have, what it means for his flagship environment policies, and whether he can secure things like abortion rights for the future. In order to understand how a Biden presidency might pan out, we've got to take a little history lesson. That's because the president's powers are derived from the US Constitution, which was drawn up in the late 18th century. The people who wrote the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, wanted to make sure that America could never be ruled by a tyrant. They'd had enough of that in England under George III. So they set out a system of checks and balances to constrain the president's powers. And one of the most important checks on the president's powers is the fact that he or she cannot propose or vote on laws. That's the job of the 535 members of Congress. So that means if a new president wants to get stuff done, he or she has to build support in both houses on Capitol Hill. Those two houses are the Senate, which has 100 members, 2 from each of the 50 states, and the House of Representatives, which has 435 members who are allocated to states on the basis of how big their population is. Members of Congress are elected separately to the president, so it's not unusual to have a Democrat in the White House and Republicans controlling one or both houses of Congress, or vice versa. In that situation, it can be tricky for presidents to get their way. So is that going to happen to Joe Biden? As I speak, the Democrats are set to keep control of the House of Representatives, which they have held for the last 2 years, yet they did lose some seats. But in the Senate, which Republicans have held since 2015, things are close. The Republicans have 50 seats and the Democrats have 48. Now there is a runoff for 2 seats in January in Georgia that could decide the balance of power. So it will be next year and just 2 weeks before the new president is sworn in until we know which party will control the Senate. Keep in mind that any bill he wants to pass would need majorities in both houses of Congress in order to become law. That means he has a tiny margin of error. It would only take one Democratic rebel in the Senate or a small handful of them in the House to scupper anything he wants to push through. And there are some divisions in the party between those pushing a more progressive agenda and those wanting to be more moderate. And if the Democrats don't gain control of the Senate, it's going to be even harder for him to get what he wants. In 2014, then President Barack Obama complained that the Republicans, who at that time controlled the House of Representatives, had blocked 500 bills.
Mr. Biden moves to recommit the conference report on the bill.
Now, Biden sat in the Senate for 35 years and was known to work across the aisle with Republicans. And he'll try to make the most of that experience and his relationship with senators to push through his agenda. He was credited with helping to pass Obamacare through both houses in 2010. But Biden has said to some Democrats he wants to be as progressive as FDR was in the 1930s. Can he really do that with a Republican Party still tied to the Trump agenda and led by Mitch McConnell in the Senate, the man who blocked most of Obama's legislation and will likely push back against Biden? That fact will weigh heavily on Joe Biden's mind when he considers his environment policies. During the campaign, Biden promised to make sure the US achieves a 100% clean energy economy and reaches net zero emissions no later than 2050.
I'll bring us back into the Paris Agreement. I'll put us back in the business of leading the world on climate change.
Some of the policies he'll need to achieve this can be passed without congressional support, using executive orders. These are a bit like laws and can be drawn up and signed by the president without going through Congress. Biden says he'll sign a bunch of them on day one of his presidency to get his environment policy off the ground. He'll also be able to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement without Senate approval. That's the international deal that President Trump pulled America out of during his time in office.
The United States will cease all implementation of the non-binding Paris Accord.
But executive orders aren't limitless. Biden also knows that a big chunk of his policy depends on Congress passing legislation. He says he'll insist this happens in his first year in office. But if the Democrats don't get control of the Senate, or even if they have a really small margin there, this flagship policy could be out of his hands. And it's not just laws that are a problem if the president can't control Congress. it also affects his ability to appoint people in high office. One of the great powers of a president is the ability to pick the nation's top judges, both in the Supreme Court and at lower levels. Judicial appointments are one of the ways that presidents feel they're building their legacy, because the people they put on the bench can stay there for life.
I stand before you today to fulfill one of my highest and most important duties under the United States Constitution, the nomination of a Supreme Court justice.
And the rulings they make can have huge consequences for decades to come. Just think of the famous Roe versus Wade case of 1973, which protects a woman's right to an abortion, or the 2015 ruling, which secured marriage rights for same-sex couples across America.
I'm nominating Harriet Ellen Myers.
But as George W. Bush found in his final years as president, judicial appointments can get very difficult if your party doesn't control the Senate, which has the final say on whether the president's candidate gets into the courtroom. The fear among many Democrats is that those landmark progressive rulings, particularly the abortion rights ruling, Roe versus Wade, could be undone if the conservative majority isn't diluted. Biden has said that he will convene a national commission, a bipartisan group of constitutional scholars, to study the court system and suggest reforms. And he wants to hear those recommendations after 180 days. But there's one area where the president might not be so constrained, and that's foreign policy. Legislation from the 1970s gives presidents the power to impose economic sanctions on other countries, and some analysts expect Joe Biden to use this power on Russia if he makes it to the White House. The incoming president has also said he would commit to preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon and wants to maintain sanctions on the country. And from what we've heard on the campaign, we can expect him to take a similar approach with North Korea. But that's not to say Biden would have free reign over foreign policy. There are still some areas where Congress has control. Big international treaties usually need to be approved by 2/3 of senators, which again means if the Democrats don't control the Senate, that would mean roping in Republicans to pass the vote. So for the most part, the limits on the president's powers come from Congress. But there is one other part of the Constitution that, let's face it, might become relevant during Joe Biden's time in office. By the time he's sworn in, Joe Biden will be 78, taking the dubious honour of the oldest president ever from Ronald Reagan. Now, he seems fit and healthy today, but it's not impossible that he could get ill over the next 4 years. And if that happens, there's a whole procedure in place to make sure things go smoothly. It's all set out in the 25th Amendment to the US Constitution, which was drawn up in the 1960s in part because of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The 25th Amendment clarifies that if the president falls ill or is somehow incapacitated, the vice president can become president. This can be temporary and done at the president's choice, for example, if he has a medical procedure. But if the vice president has to take over permanently, then he or she, in this case it would be Kamala Harris, can appoint a new vice president to fill the vacancy she leaves. That person in turn would have to be approved by Congress. But with a global pandemic and a nail-biting election, we've had enough drama for a few years, so let's hope we don't get to that stage. So there it is. Joe Biden is poised to take over the presidency, but it won't necessarily be plain sailing when he gets to the Oval Office. With a small majority in the House of Representatives and control of the Senate up in the air, he'll have to work hard to try to unify both parties to his cause. Something he does have experience in, but never before in his long career in US politics have the Democrats and Republicans been so divided. He may have to wait until the midterm elections in 2022 to try to firm up Democratic control of Congress. So all eyes are now on how he treads this tricky path for the next 4 years. Yes, President-elect Biden has the largest mandate ever as leader of the US, but his defeated rival also managed to secure more than 70 million votes. So the question is, will Joe Biden be a transformative president or simply a transitional one?